let's talk about my favorite books of the year. For this video, I kind of came up with like superlatives for things because if you watch any of my videos about like rating and reviewing, I personally really hate the concept of ranking because I read across a bunch of genres. I read fiction, I read nonfiction, and just the idea that like we can rank books that are trying to achieve different things just doesn't work for me. I talked about this in my most disappointing reads of the year. I guess I'm just on that horse right now because I'm watching people rank videos or rank books, and I'm like, how? How are you doing it? Explain it to me. Is it just off of like how much you enjoyed it? Because I don't know. I guess for me, more goes into it than just my like raw enjoyment of a book. That's not the only thing I'm like thinking of when I'm reviewing or determining if I enjoyed a book, which sounds contradictory, but in my head it's not. We're going to start off with some like honorary mentions. So I want to talk about 2 books that were super hyped on BookTube and I think are worth the hype. The first one I read at the beginning of the year before I had a channel, and that is why can't I think of the name? Kiley Reid. Oh my god, I'm blanking on the name. Such a Fun Age by Kiley Reid. This was kind of all over the place, and it was just a book that for me really lived up to the hype. I listened to it on audio, and there were points where I thought that the language might have been a little stilted if you were reading it on, like, physically, but how the audiobook narrator conveyed, especially like the millennial speaking, was really worked really well for me. I liked that it had a millennial protagonist who wasn't super ambitious. She was just trying to live her life and then shit happened to her. I really liked that it was looking at racism through a lens that I personally haven't seen as much, where it's like this person, this wasp in this book who like thinks she's doing good. There's a moment in when she's at her Thanksgiving dinner where she literally like counts the number of people of color at her table and thinks like, I'm doing something good, or like I'm checking a box by like inviting non-white people into my life, I guess. It was interesting there. And then like it had more layers on top of the racism, on top of just the basic plot line that kept me intrigued, and for me it was worth the hype. I read that one at the beginning of the year. I read this one at the end of the year. I just finished it a few days ago. Another one I think was really worth the hype was my Dark Vanessa. This was everywhere a few years ago, and I was really like trepidatious going into it because a lot of the time hyped books don't really work well for me, and this was hyped on like every avenue of BookTube I was watching. People with completely different tastes loved it, and I can see why. I mean, it was dark, like there is sexual assault and rape like on the page being described, so just keep that in mind before you choose to pick this up, and if that would be triggering for you. But what I think, and I don't know, it's been a while since I watched people review this book, but one thing that I think this book did really well was the dual timeline. I think a lot of people take issue with dual timeline, and I'm personally not one of those people. I can get on board with a dual timeline, but this one I think did a really good job of maintaining your interest in both timelines. There's this present timeline of people, the sexual assault or like the sexual allegations against her teacher coming out. And then there's the timeline in the past where you see her from the ages of like 15 to 22 when the grooming and sexual assault starts, up until the point where she is in college. I think that pacing was done just really well between those two timelines. It's one of the best in terms of dual timeline, it's one of the best I've read, where the pacing and intrigue are like very similar between the two, and you feel like you're going at the same pace, and it didn't matter which time I was in. I was very interested to see what happened next. A place where it was able to have like maybe a more nuanced conversation was making Vanessa for most of the book in the present tense and in the previous time, not really realize or come to terms with the fact that she was raped and that it was not a romantic relationship. She was not living a romance. She was living through grooming and assault. And because she wouldn't take that idea in for herself, she also victim blamed everyone else. So it made her a bit more complex. You couldn't just immediately totally empathize and sympathize with her. You could, because she had so many struggles that she was going through. So yeah, I would recommend those two quite a bit. And then another one I want to talk about is a book that is, I would say, underhyped, the opposite end. There's hyped ones that I think are worth it. This one, last I checked, had less than 20 reviews on Goodreads. That's The Slave Yards. So this is translated from the Arabic. It came out from a smaller press, Syracuse University. This is a book in multiple timelines as well. It starts in the future, it starts in the present, it kind of goes back into the past, where this girl kind of relives her life living as a biracial girl in the slave yards, this area that she lived in her country. I believe this, if I remember correctly, this takes place in Libya, but it's saying late 19th century Benghazi. It goes back into the past of this girl living in the slave yards, and then it goes back again to her mother's life and kind of what brought her to this point. I just thought it was really well done and really well executed, and I just find it so bizarre that so few people have read it. So I would recommend you try to pick it up. There is no order or reason here. We're just kind of rolling. Next one I want to talk about is my favorite series I completed in 2021. For this one, I am going with the Wayfarers series by Becky Chambers. For me, the Wayfarers series was such a nice blend of kind of a contemporary feel to a book, a slice of life feel, while being in a sci-fi setting. And I liked the range of the books and what they were exploring and the level they were exploring it at. So in the first book, you have a big cast of characters. You really are seeing it through one character's eyes mainly, though it is a third person, if I'm remembering. Yeah, it is a third person. And you're kind of just watching them in an episodal type situation, get to a place, and there's plot stuff happening, but it's mainly a character dynamic. Then the second one, it is much more about two beings, and there's dual timeline in that one. You're kind of seeing people dealing, or beings dealing with their own idea of humanity, but much more on a personal level. This one, it's just looking at a few main characters. The third one was my least favorite, but it mainly had all human protagonists, and it was taking place all in one space, and you were bouncing between characters, and they were kind of interconnected. And that one was much more about humanity and how humanity kind of ties in with the rest of the species. And then the fourth one, which was probably my favorite, was an exploration of, there were no human characters, and it was a lot about xenophobia and prejudices that different species have with each other. And I just really love sci-fi as a lens to look at humanity from maybe a step away, by not just looking at humans specifically, but you're looking at the humanity of things, and you're able to have a bit more nuanced conversations because you can extend the limits of what humanity, culture, social structures look like. So there are going to be a few sci-fis that come up on this list. All right. Now, for the superlative of new to me author, even though there are multiple new to me authors on this, that's fine. We're going to go for, I'm pulling it out, The Break by Katherena Vermette. It's an intergenerational story, not specifically taking place across multiple generations, like time-wise, chronologically. It is all taking place in one contemporary setting, and there are multiple generations of women, of Métis women, who are kind of centering around a trauma. And this one does have trigger warnings at the beginning, and I would recommend you look at them because there is a rape in this. It is very graphically described at some point, so yeah, keep that in mind. But the dynamics of all of the friendships, the dynamics of the relationships of all of the characters that are related, there's some perspectives of the officers involved. There is the perspective of the perpetrator, which was interesting. It was an interesting idea to add that element. I didn't necessarily empathize with the person, even though they went through things. And then just how all of the characters, the non-related characters, were connected to the other people in the story was very seamless. I highly recommend this read. I thought it was really well done. I also read this on audio and thought the audiobook was very good as well. For my favorite debut of the year, that is Darryl by Jackie Ess. So this is about a man in a relationship, and like him and his wife do some cuckolding, and then it kind of just goes from there. It is a very close first person. It's a very casual conversational tone that you have with Darryl as he is just kind of going through life, going through like drug addictions, going through different sexual like explorations, and then there's this underlying kind of gender exploration that is less directly on the page, but there are moments of him kind of questioning and the people around him questioning his gender. And then there's just a lot of weird shit that happens. I feel like this book has a lot of potential for rereadability because you could kind of look at it through so many different lenses and almost have a different experience while you're reading it. It was so interesting because the writing was so simple. It seemed so straightforward. It's very small, but there was so much that you can like grasp onto. And every review I've watched of this book focuses on something different, which I think is just a feat in itself. It means that you gave so much for the readers to grasp onto. As you probably know if you watch this channel, I listen to a ton of audiobooks. I would say a majority of the books I consume are via audio, and this one, while I also did enjoy the book, this is going to be for the audiobook narration. And that is Behold the Dreamers by Imbolo and Mbue. This is narrated by Prentice Unayemi, and this book is about, where are they from? Two Cameroonian immigrants who come to the United States kind of looking for that white picket fence life, like live the American dream. Dynamically, this book was a really interesting like exploration of a familial relationship. Jende, the man of the relationship, and then Neni. And when they start out, Jende is really wants to become an American. He looks for a job. He starts working as a driver for a white wealthy man who I believe works on Wall Street. And Neni is taking care of their son, trying to go back to school, but also becomes involved in the life of the person that Jende is driving for. And so it's an exploration of those kind of this immigrant family from Cameroon and this white upper middle class family kind of coming together and like the clashing or the circumstances of them, which I thought was very well explored. And then just the way that Jende and Neni kind of grow and evolve in this book was interesting. There's a lot to hold on to with the plot. There's a lot to hold on to with the characters. At times there's a little bit too much, but it was all brought to life really well by the narrator. It has stuck with me as something that was greatly narrated, and I've actually looked into other books that person has narrated to see if they were things I would be interested in, because he did such a good job with this. Okay, next one. My favorite short story I read. So, in May, I had Kindle Unlimited at the time because every once in a while they offer it for free or like for a very reduced price, and I like jump on it and like binge some stuff and then cancel it before it starts costing me money. And I listened to a bunch of Amazon original short stories, and the one, like the short story I've read of the year really that stuck with me the most is Parsnips in Love. And it's basically just about this Iranian man who is a farmer, and he pulls some parsnips up, and it's one parsnip that kind of like, you know, when you grow your own food, it kind of comes out like an interesting shape, and it's shaped like two people in a romantic embrace. It then goes on to be posted onto social media and become a sensation. Everyone's obsessed with these parsnips in love. And it explores his sexual and romantic relationship with his wife and the social media in itself and people's kind of reaction to viral moments. Just for a short story, what it was doing was really interesting, and just conceptually it was so weird. And if you ever want to give to Amazon, which I don't necessarily recommend, you can listen to it, read it through there. But let's move on to short story collections, because that was just one short story, and I was trying to just pick one for each like superlative, but I couldn't, so I picked two. And they're actually both sci-fi collections, and the first one is Invisible Planets, edited by Ken Liu. These are all sci-fis that are translated from the Chinese. Essentially, this is just a bunch of short stories that Ken Liu has read that he really liked, and so he curated it and translated it into a collection in English. And I guess Ken Liu and I have very similar tastes because I liked or loved almost everything in here. There's multiple authors in here, and then some of the authors have more than one story in here, and so he gives a little bio of each of the authors before their stories, which is nice. There's so much you can do with the sci-fi genre. Some of them are very light sci-fi, where they're like maybe dystopian, and it's kind of what sci-fi like life could look like. Some of them like kind of go the technological route. Some of them go like the space route. For the concept of sci-fi, it's a wide range of things that fit within that genre, and they just look at humanity itself in such provocative ways throughout. If you like short stories, if you're curious about if you like sci-fi, if you're not sure what kind of sci-fi you like, I just feel like this is a really good collection to kind of explore those things. One thing I will say is that when I read an anthology that has multiple contributors, I like to use it to kind of see if those authors would be people I would want to read in long form, and most of these authors don't have any other translated literature, so you can't use it for that purposes. But there is a follow-up to this that I have not read called something Planets, Hidden Planets, I think. So you can still get more. I think there's a lot of repeat authors on that list, or in that second book. Second one for that is Love After the End, an anthology of two-spirit and indigiqueer speculative fiction edited by Joshua Whitehead. So this is also a sci-fi collection, but it is more about like looking into the future. So they're very like utopian and dystopian, which if you believe in the concept of utopian, sure, I personally don't because I'm a pessimist. It kind of looks into the future. It explores a lot of potential futures of leaving the planet or of running out of resources or in indigenous folk finding ways to survive through those things. Multiple of them talk about the concept of colonization, like colonizing new planets. And as a people who have been colonized was, I don't want to say more interesting, but was like maybe a little bit more rooted through living through the experience of being colonized in the past and currently living on your native land or being displaced from your native land and living with colonizers. Again, the array of things while still kind of maintaining that like more narrow scope. Within the sci-fi genre, there was a lot of different perspectives, there was a lot of different takes, there was a lot of different ranges of things that they were looking at, and I just found it really great, and I would highly recommend it. This one, I probably should have put it on my like most disappointing of the year, but it's kind of like a backhanded compliment because it's my DNF that I'm most likely to resurrect. But the one I'm going to choose for this, and I think it's because it's a trilogy, and I gave it like maybe 20 to 30% into the first book, and there's a lot of hype around it, and that is The City of Brass by S.A. Chakraborty. I hear that the first book is hard to get into, and that it ends with a bang and that the books get better and better. However, it had a lot of tropes for an adult book that were very reminiscent of YA tropes. This, I'm not like other girls, the love triangle that was developing, and was it a love triangle? I don't even remember at this point. And then there were like a few kind of like plot conveniences, and just those things combined made me want to DNF it, so I did. But I could probably be convinced to give it a second chance. I just personally didn't think that it was worth trying to get through, especially because there was also like two people that you were bouncing between, and they weren't connected at all, and I was like, okay, you gotta connect these for me, because I'm just like, I know that they're going to at some point, so I can't keep caring about them being like separate for this long. Anyway, moving back onto books I finished and enjoyed, I just wanted to throw that one in there. So one of my intentions in my reading this year was to read more stuff in translation, and one of my favorite books, or my favorite book in translation this year, was The Housekeeper and the Professor by Yoko Ogawa. I like to think of it kind of as being like a little bit of a misnomer, because it's the housekeeper and the professor and the housekeeper's son, and the housekeeper has memory issues where he can only remember the last 80 minutes, and the housekeeper becomes the housekeeper. No one in this book is named. The housekeeper's son is called Root because the professor thinks his head looks like the square root sign, and the professor is a professor, or was a professor of mathematics. And it is like the look at their relationship, the relationship of people when one person doesn't have the ability to remember you day after day, but the progression of a relationship and the deepening of feelings that might kind of be one-sided, and also the exploration of like their relationship through mathematics. The professor has such a joyous outlook on mathematics, and anytime math or numbers is brought up, he is so excited and has like kind of like math facts at the top of his head. I think it was just like a really beautiful and charming book. For me, books like this can get too cloying, but it was on the right side of like not too cloying, just being charming. And I just really loved it, and really loved the characters, and just really loved the little story that got weaved together. You kind of knew in time, like at times, where it was going, but it wrapped me up in its arms so quickly, and I was like, I teared up like at something that happened at the halfway point, and I couldn't believe I was already so emotionally invested in everything happening. So yeah, really love this book. My favorite classic I read of the year was Brown Girl Brownstone by Paule Marshall. So this was a book that I picked up randomly at the used bookstore. I had never heard anything about it, and it is a coming of age of a young Black girl in Brooklyn in the 30s and 40s. So You see her from like the age, I think, of 7 and 8 up to the age of 18. And she lives in a brownstone where it's kind of like, not like completely communal living, but kind of. It's not quite an apartment where you have like your privacy of having a lot of your own spaces. Much of them are shared. So you see a lot of the people that live in the brownstone with them. You kind of see Selena interact with the people who live in the brownstone. You also see her really engaging with her parents, who are both Barbadian immigrants, and the dad really wants to go back to Barbados and like get his land, and the wife wants to stay here and build a foundation here and live the American dream. And there is there's tension between those two because they do not get along. You really see her relationship to the both of them. And this book, because it takes such an expansive time that it's looking at, you really see Selena in moments of interacting in relationships that impacted her. So most of the moments you see, if not all of them, are relationships that changed her. She comes into herself sexually, she comes into her friendships, she comes into her race later on. But I think that the most interesting part to me was the third part, where you really see an exploration of the relationship between her parents. It is full of tension. There's a lot happening plot-wise, and the way that this is told is so emotionally intensive. It's hard not to be like sucked into the writing of this and like the emotions that each character is really feeling, because it's very visceral. Next is my favorite nonfiction of the year. That would be The Making of Asian America. This book is exactly what it says. It's like the making of Asian America, the coming of Asian immigrants by country, so through times. This book's scope is pretty large in what it's trying to tell you. This is one of those books that I read, and afterwards I was like, why didn't I know this stuff? Especially being educated K through 12. Actually, all of my education took place in California, which is where a lot of Asian immigration has occurred. Via Angel Island and other channels. I just felt like I learned so much that I should have already known. It is the making of Asian America. It does touch on things that were happening in Latin America and in Canada, which a lot of it, at least in Canada, was very similar. It touches on Japanese internment. It talks about the Philippines as a territory, and people's rights or lack of rights. It talks about the fact that immigration law came from Asian immigrants into the United States and the xenophobia around that. And it was just an all-around book where I just learned so freaking much. Yeah, I just have those moments where I'm like, how? I literally grew up less than an hour from Angel Island. Like, how did I not know this stuff? It was just kind of mind-blowing. So yeah, that was my favorite nonfiction of the year. I just realized that there's a book that's like I had pulled out that I didn't make a superlative for, which I think could have gone in the most hyped. But those two most hyped I did at the beginning, Such a Fun Age and My Dark Vanessa, I wouldn't really consider like favorites of the years. I just thought that they were worth the hype. But this one I would consider like truly a favorite of the year, and that is the Essex Serpent by Sarah Perry. This is at its core just a really tight look at relationships between people. You have your main character, Cora, and her companion. She's wealthy, so she can pay someone to like live with her. I still don't understand that Victorian thing. I think her name was Martha. I don't remember. Cora's husband dies at the very beginning of this. It was an abusive relationship. She didn't have much control over her life. She has a son who you can probably read as autistic, and it's her kind of coming into herself and exploring herself as an adult and exploring her passions. And then she goes to Old Winter, which is a small town, and she meets the pastor, priest, vicar, one of those things there. And builds a relationship with him and his family. There's this idea of intimacy. There's the relationships between people that are platonic. There's intimate feelings that are not reciprocated. And it's just kind of like a converging of like these maybe 8 main characters. And it kind of is all tied together by Cora wanting to go to Old Winter because there's potentially the Essex Serpent there. I was just so entranced by not only the characters and how flawed they were, but the relationship dynamics themselves. I thought that it was very complex. I said this in my wrap-up, but there were letters in this that I was screaming in my head while I was listening to this. It was just like how softly worded yet so strong in emotion. Some of them packed a punch. It was a book that I was scared would not live up to the hype, and it really did for me. It was such a great read. The next, another one that takes place in Victorian time. This superlative I would like to call I'm hooked. Like, I've read multiple books by this author now, and I want to read their whole backlist, which isn't that long, unfortunately, but that is Sarah Waters. I read Affinity this year. This is about a woman who, before the book started, she tried to commit suicide. She is in a wealthy class of society. She needs something to do with her time, essentially. So she starts going to a woman's prison to be a good person because wealthy women didn't have much else to do. She's not married. She's obviously gay, but it's Victorian age, so what are you going to do about it? And then she becomes fascinated with this woman who is spiritual, and before she went into prison, performed seances. And so you see this timeline, and then you see the timeline of the woman before she was in prison and kind of the events that led up to it. And you watch their relationship develop. It has just great plot twists, just the characters, the plot, everything, the writing, the atmosphere. I'm just hooked. I'm like in, like, let's do it, Sarah Waters. I'm going to read all of your books. My very last one, which kind of feels like a fake category because I didn't actually read it for my first time in 2021, but that is my favorite reread, which is the Mistborn Trilogy Era 1 by Brandon Sanderson. Listen, I know that some of you aren't fantasy readers, but I would highly encourage you, even if you don't think you're a fantasy reader, to try this series. And that is because there's so much more to it than the fantasy elements. Like, I think that a lot of the time people who like literary works maybe aren't willing to try genre fiction as much because they're worried that the thematic content will suffer. And I just am here to completely disagree with this book. I have a full review of this that I'm probably going to be putting up in the next week, so I'll link it somewhere. So yes, this series is fantasy at its core. The writing is there to get the job done. There is magic, and there's a plot, and there's intrigue, but there's also really interesting characters that are all incredibly different. There are interesting plot dynamics happening. The relationships, the character arcs themselves are really just superbly done. The pacing of them is really nice. And then just to look at religion and the text on the page about religion, but then the subtext of the religion. And if you just looked at this series through the lens of religion, which I think would be hard to do on a first read, to be honest, if you were just trying to look at it through the context of religion, just because there's a lot to grasp onto. Not saying that this is a hard book to read, it definitely isn't. It's super accessible. But if you just looked at this through the lens of religion, I don't think that you could tell me that thematically there's less going on here than in any of the books I mentioned before. Listen, I know that a lot of BookTube fans over this series, and I'm part of that hype train. Like, I am sold. This is like a series I'm going to keep rereading into the future. I freaking love it. I recognize its flaws. You can listen to them in my review, but this video isn't about the flaws. It's about what I love, and I just really love this series, and I think that even if you don't like fantasy, you should just try it. But I will say that if you do look at it through the lens of religion, you're really not going to get the full scope until you read the 3 books. It's much more superficial in book 1. That is my list. Tell me about your favorite book of 2021 in the comments below. Yeah, until next time, happy reading!